Well, it's taken a while, but the time is finally here. I'm finally getting the 4K versus 2K video done, and it's got some very interesting results. Well, I think the first thing to say is the summary of what my findings have been looking into all these 4Ks versus 2Ks, effectively the UHD Blu-ray discs against the Blu-ray discs. And I think it's fair to say that I have vastly underestimated the high quality of Blu-ray, and comparing the 4Ks to the Blu-rays on some of these titles, it's obvious that Blu-rays have always been a lot better than I ever considered they were. I think as what happens is when you get your 4K equipment, you just assume being 4 times the picture quality, it's going to be that much better. And it's just like hi-fi, ever diminishing returns. The better your hi-fi is, the more money you have to spend to get a similar return in improvement in quality, and that seems to be the case with Blu-ray against 4K. There really is very little perceptible difference, and the conclusion I have reached, as well as Keith at Euphoria Pictures, John at Mondo Chelovec, and I think John Ellsworth at Project Ellsworth is finding the same. The major difference between the two is the high dynamic range or Dolby Vision HDR, and it's the enhanced colour to make videos look more like film. Now that I've got fantastic B somewhere to find them in my hand, this came with one of the players. I thought it was quite a poor picture to advertise 4K, and shot at 2.8K, released to cinemas at 2K, it probably tells its own story. So really the HDR is the only improvement on that, and I'll probably never watch that film again. I think it's a youngster's film, really. Not something for us adults, or those adults that never grow up. But anyway, getting back to Midway, I thoroughly enjoyed this film. The picture quality, until I started playing with it, the contrast was overblown. It was just blown out, and that comes down to the HDR setting button, which I think all UHD players have got on Panasonics. It's just to the right top of the circular controls here, and the outdoor sequences look best on the lowest of the 4 settings, but normally I have it set on bright environment, the highest, and the outdoor settings there were just washed out, so you have to play with that. And anyway, we got to compromise them, and the outdoors and the indoors looked really good, I think, on natural environment. So that's something to bear in mind with 4Ks whenever you put a disc on. It's worth checking to start with what it looks best on. A bit annoying really, but that's something I've just learned over the time. Midway was a bit like A Few Good Men, which was remastered into 4K in 2017, and for a long time I thought the 2K, the Blu-ray, was better, but you go to the HDR button and you play with that, and indeed you can get the 4K and the 2K looking very similar. Probably a bit more sharpness on the 4K, but maybe a bit close to cool now I mention it. War for the Planet of the Apes is one of those I picked up on 4K after enjoying the first 2 on Blu-ray, and this was shot live action, or the live action sequences were shot in 6.5K, so probably around 35mm quality in video terms. Very good film, but released to cinemas in 2K, and so although it's a very good image on this, I think it's the HDR, the high dynamic range as usual, that's making the difference, giving you that enhanced colour and more depth in the dark sequences, so less crushing in the blacks. But here's an interesting one that I didn't see at the cinema, I would have liked to. Ryan Gosling in First Man, the story of Neil Armstrong and the first man on the moon. And I knew that the moon landing sequence in this had been shot in 70mm IMAX, so I was expecting something special for that, and that wasn't disappointing. But the rest of it was shot in a variety of formats. It was Super 16mm, which isn't very big as you can imagine, but also VistaVision and Techniscope. Now VistaVision is probably a good accompaniment to 70mm IMAX because it's a horizontal 35mm process. Now if you look at a 35mm here, you'll see the standard vertical frame size. Now, horizontal VistaVision twists the film as it goes through the camera, and it shoots onto the frames horizontally. So rather than getting these standard 35mm frames, it shoots across horizontally, and you get between 3 and 4 times the image area. So you can imagine how good that looks. Probably the equivalent of about 20K on video, I would imagine. So quite a special process, but that in itself nowhere near what 70mm IMAX is, I can tell you. And in that regard, I'll show you 2 of the films that were shot mainly in IMAX 70mm that made it onto 4K, and probably should look better than they do actually, but still very impressive. Dunkirk, Christopher Nolan film, and Interstellar, Christopher Nolan film. Now, I only saw a sequence from this at the Waterloo IMAX, which has got a 90-foot screen, so one of only 3 cinemas in Britain, I think, that can screen genuine IMAX, 70mm IMAX. We got Bradford, the London Waterloo, and the London Science Museum. But anyway, 70mm IMAX film is sharper than the human eye can take in, just unbelievable to see. And anyone who hasn't seen genuine 70mm IMAX and flat, I wouldn't recommend 3D because that spoils the image quality. If you can get along to one of those cinemas and get a chance to see a film like this, you'll be amazed at how good these things are. So the fact that these 2 were done 70mm IMAX, that picture quality does shrink down onto our 4K discs, and these are exceptionally good. Not the whole films are shot in IMAX, but you can tell where the 35mm comes in. You don't get the whole IMAX image, it's still cropped a bit top and bottom, as we're screening 16:9 and not the 1:6:1, which I think IMAX is. But the film that really made me sit up and take notice as to how much better 4K can be to 2K is Clint Eastwood's The Mule. Now, there's a scene in this at the start, because he's a lily dealer, he's growing and selling lilies, and a very colourful close-up of some of his lilies growing in the ground, and it looked lovely. But this film was only released to theatres in 2K, I think, or 2.5K something. It's very low quality, so around 16mm in film terms. But the colours on these lilies really did, they were vivid, they stood out, very vibrant. And so I looked at the same scene on the Blu-ray disc, and it didn't have that vibrancy. It looked very ordinary by comparison. And so that confirmed to me that even if a film is only released in 2K, and it's been released to the home movie market as a 4K, it's still worth getting a 4K disc, because the high dynamic range makes the image look more like a 35mm film than it does with Blu-ray. And so for that, every time I will be buying the 4K if it's available, just in the hope that they've got it right and the picture quality is that much better owing to the HDR. Now, I have apologised to a few people that haven't been around lately. I really haven't had the time, because I've been producing my own Blu-ray and DVD, and this has taken me 2.5 years to film. It's just come out. It's a documentary about Rover cars, and particularly the R40 cars, which was the 75 and the MG ZT. And that's just come out, and it's been interesting really, because I go through some of the same issues producing one of these as the studios do. And believe me, it's not easy. Every time you come to master the finished product, there's something that comes up and bites you in the backside. And what should take you a couple of days will take you a couple of weeks or even months. And so when I see people saying that, oh, they've remastered a film but they haven't put Dolby Atmos track on it, well, believe me, the amount of work involved in remastering a soundtrack into Dolby Atmos is going to take an awful long time and an awful lot of money. So most of the time it's probably not worth considering, so it's quite amazing that the studios do it at all. Now, John Perry at Mondo Celovec Movies, he's become a bit of a 4K enthusiast and has become a very trusted source on getting guidance on what is good on 4K and what isn't so good. He's been finding similar things to me, but as a result of some of the recommendations he's been putting out recently, and he has put quite a few interesting 4K videos of his entire 4K collection up recently, and I'm hoping he's going to do a 4K versus 2K similar to mine soon as well, and go through his top 10 perhaps. But because of his recommendations on Blu-rays and 4Ks. Many of the purchases I've been making recently have been down to John Perry at Mondo Celovec. He was very into the film The Shining, and he recently got the £35 special edition, and so I talked him into letting me purchase his original copy of The Shining, which on his system he reckons is one of the best. Now, it's a very good image on that, a very good transfer, but it's not one of the best on mine. And that rather confirmed to me that all our systems are different. And John has been picking up film grain or noise on some of the 4Ks that I've said are the best, in particular Murder on the Orient Express, which was shot in 65mm, absolutely perfect to look at. Very little film grain owing to the large film gauge size and the modern fine grain film stocks. That for me is the best 4K disc that exists, but it's obvious that on other people's systems it may not look quite so good, and that could be because your television or your video projector is doing digital processing, and that can introduce noise, but it's not doing that on mine. Fortunately, I'm able to turn all the digital processing off on mine, and so John Perry was getting the same thing with Top Gun, which was shot in Super 35. So as I said in my review of this, doesn't really have any business looking as good as it does. But at the time I thought that was the second best 4K that I'd seen. It may still be, but I think that has been surpassed with Le Mans 66. Originally it was going to be called Ford versus Ferrari, so it was a bit of a surprise when it came out with a different name. But for me, being a bit of a petrol head, but also very much an enthusiast of vintage racing and Le Mans in the mid-60s, with my favourite car company Triumph being there with the Spitfires and the TRs and that, this is an absolutely perfect film. The music, the acting, the colour, filmed digitally, but it just proves that it can be done with video cameras. Probably the second best 4K that I've seen. Perhaps I should give another mention to Gemini Man, which a lot of people have said is so sharp, best they've seen. Well, I think this is the worst 4K disc I've seen, but that's only because the way this has been made, and I might have done it a bit of a disservice perhaps, because I think if I was to have seen this at the Waterloo IMAX on the 90-foot wide screen in 3D, I think the 3D glasses, which immediately reduce the impact of the image quality, it reduces the image quality, there's no two ways about that. The overly enhanced colours on this, the unrealistic motion, everything about it that's been digitized to make it look like a computer game might have actually helped the 3D. And it was shot at 120 frames a second, so 60 frames a second by 2, one for each eye. That's I think what happened. So I suspect that if I'd have seen this at the cinema, I'd have thought it was the best 3D I'd ever seen. I have very little doubt of that. And that's what its market was. It was aimed at youngsters going to see it in 3D, and for that I might have actually enjoyed it. But as it is, not really a film for anyone below the age of about 25, I think, but others may disagree with me, I don't know. But another film that John Perry sent me, which is a Blu-ray, and he sent me this to have a look, it's Scott Eastwood, who's Clint Eastwood's son, Blu-ray of this film called Overdrive that I'd never heard of, but a bit of a dream for me because there's all these fantastic classic cars in it, in exotic locations. And he was absolutely right, this is just like a good 4K disc, but it's a Blu-ray. Even the colours on it, it looks like HDR. So it's not the best film in the world, it's good fun. It's not going to be very memorable, I think, if you're not into cars, but if you want to see great image quality on a Blu-ray, then that is probably just about the best we've seen. So well worth taking a look at. So the summary is, I've underestimated Blu-ray, but if a film comes out in 4K, I am going to go for the 4K disc simply because just about every time the HDR gives it the edge over the 2K. So let's see what others think. Hopefully John Perry at Mondo Celovec will upload his video soon, and also John Ellsworth at Project Ellsworth, who is going to be looking at one of the other best 4K discs, which I've already reviewed, Jaws. And as I said in the review of that, lovely film grain in that one. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and perhaps also consider subscribing, so I'll be encouraged to produce similar content in the future. As you can see, I've got a lot of 4K and Blu-ray discs to look at, so until we get to the next one, bye bye for now.